The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
It was as if the Ripper were a ghost. He managed to entice his victim into the square, perform a brutal murder, position the body and viscera in a specific manner, steal parts of her body, and slip away invisibly into the night with a time scale of 8 or 9 minutes. I've tried to imagine what it must have been like meeting the Ripper. Was he in a state of great excitement, having failed to carry out his rituals? Was he covered in blood? How did he escape all the police in the area? From Naming Jack the Ripper by Russell Edwards. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is episode 127, part 2, Women with No Voice. Well, it is hot out. Make sure you keep hydrated as you listen, and I see you as you hear me. Just a reminder, murder bookies, you know you need to listen to part 1 before you get to part 2, right? Yeah, I know you do. My open was from Russell Edwards' book, Naming Jack the Ripper, The Definitive Reveal, an amazing source for me in creating this trilogy. I cannot more highly praise the other 2 books that were crucial, Haley Rubenhold's The Five, The Untold Stories of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. And since we do actually need to examine the Ripper murders, I utilized Robert House's book, Jack the Ripper and the Case for Scotland Yard's Prime Suspect. And I also used London's Black Museum files on Jack the Ripper, given to me by Catherine Ramsland. How cool is that? But the complete list of my sources are on my blog, June 2025, at www.murdershelfbookclub.com. Now, before I begin the long-awaited part 2, I am on Creators Row at CrimeCon Denver, September 5th to 7th, 2025. If you need a badge, you can save 10% by using my code, all lowercase letters, one word, MurderShelf. Just go to www.crimecon.com/CC25 to make your purchase. I cannot wait to see all of you again. We had such a great time last year. And I also want to give a shout out to PT Blackstock and Elena Stainbrook for subscribing. Remember, you can join my Patreon for $2 to $4 a month and help me select the next true crime book to be featured on the podcast. Now, in previous episode 123, I dove into historic Victorian London and the first 2 murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. Today, I begin with Elizabeth, born November 27th, 1848, died September 30th, 1888. To my surprise, our story turns to Sweden. Prosperous farmer Gustav Eriksson paced anxiously as his wife, Beda, gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth. They were now a family of 4. Their oldest child, Anna Christina, was now 3 years old. Gustav likely hoped for a son to assist him on the farm, but his daughters brought him joy. And eventually, those sons would arrive, Lars and Svante, completing the family. Now, Elizabeth grew up doing chores, milking cows, tending chickens and pigs, making butter, while field hands did the heavy work. Beata and daughters Anna and Elizabeth focused on managing the home and their education. Sundays were dedicated to church and Bible study in their conservative Lutheran community. Now, at age 15, Elizabeth was confirmed, which marked her entry into adulthood. By age 17, she set off for Gothenburg to find work as a servant, following in her sister's footsteps, a journey about half a day's walk. Now, young women traditionally gained domestic experience before marriage, earning money for their dowries. Anna Christina worked for Bernhard Olsen, a shoemaker, and after 7 years of service, they married. Anna helped her sister Elizabeth find a position as a maid servant for Lars Fredrik Olsen, who was a lower middle-class caretaker for a block of apartments. Now, the Olsens' fortunes were rising as they had recently purchased yet another property. As Elizabeth's employers, they were required to house, feed, and care for her, and they therefore expected her to be obedient and abstain from alcohol. In 1864, Elizabeth left her job with the Olsens, moving to the nearby district of Domkirke, dominated by a huge Gothic cathedral consecrated back in 1435. This change carried risks for both her and her employer, who did prefer to hire country girls with no experience with the vices of city life. The country girls were also vulnerable to those who might prey on their inexperience, leaving them vulnerable to those with bad intentions. There were few opportunities for servants, especially women, to make friendships with men. Maid servants were not allowed in beer halls and needed permission to stay away overnight. And while they had brief interactions with, grocers, butchers, bakers, delivery men, these encounters were limited. Living in the residence, these young women often attracted the attention of the males of the household, which led to sexual liaisons, many consensual, but some not. Such entanglements might last for years, but others fell apart in weeks, damaging the women's reputations. Sometimes this resulted in women falling into prostitution after being seduced. By April 1865, Elizabeth had likely entered into a relationship with a lover who paid for her lodging, and she would adopt his surname to hide their unmarried status, which was punishable by law due to efforts to control venereal disease like syphilis. Similar laws also existed in France, Germany, and Britain, unfairly blaming these fallen women for spreading disease while men faced no repercussions. Now, in Sweden, 2 lists were kept, one for known prostitutes and another for single pregnant women suspected of immoral behavior. Well, I mention this because shortly afterward, Elizabeth became pregnant and was placed on list number 2. Abandoned by her lover, she was subjected to regular genital examinations by police doctors who labeled Elizabeth Gustafsdotter a public woman. She faced strict rules: physical inspection on Tuesday and Friday, a curfew of 11 p.m., no lingering in doorways or windows, and the requirement to dress decently in public without calling attention to herself, all implying that she was a prostitute. When asked about her family, Elizabeth claimed both parents were deceased. Well, fact was her mother had died of tuberculosis a year earlier, but her father was still living, and it appears that Anna Christina had cut ties with her sister. The shame of being unmarried and pregnant, of being treated like a prostitute when she was not, must have been demoralizing. Elizabeth, however, continued to identify herself as a servant. April 4th, 1865, Elizabeth was found to have a genital wart, which led to her immediate commitment to a treatment facility, Kurthuset, to address this venereal disease. Unfortunately, it was also discovered that Elizabeth had contracted syphilis, which had progressed to stage 2. All right, a brief overview of syphilis. After exposure, symptoms can appear 10 to 90 days later, typically starting with a chancre or a painless sore on the genitals. This sore usually heals within 3 to 6 weeks. Stage 2 begins with flu-like symptoms, swollen glands, a sore throat, a rash, and wart-like growths, which is what Elizabeth had exhibited. This stage can last from several months to a year. Now, based on circumstances, it is likely that the father of Elizabeth's child gave her syphilis. And the third stage of syphilis will come to play later in Elizabeth's story. So May 13th, she was discharged from Courthousset, where she had been treated like a prisoner in a very overcrowded ward. Now, at this time, there were 2 approved medical treatments for syphilis. One involved a mercury-based ointment, while the other required the ingestion of a mix of gold, silver, copper, bromide, iodine, and nitric acid. Both were hazardous. Elizabeth underwent treatment with hydroxyic acid, which removed the wart. While being treated at Courthousset, she gave birth to a stillborn girl at 7 months, a devastating loss compounded by her isolation, disownment, and illness. Now, in the 19th century, syphilis was poorly understood. It was believed that carriers were not contagious without visible symptoms, which is very incorrect. In 1910, the medicine Salvarsan was developed to treat the disease, followed by antibiotics later on. Now, Elizabeth experienced a relapse and she was returned to Courthousset, staying there until September, and then she was back again in October, but declared cured in November. Her disease entered a latent state, showing no symptoms and was no longer contagious. Now, once a woman's name appears on the police registry, finding respectable work became nigh impossible. By October of 1865, Elizabeth was now living on an infamous street known for streetwalkers working out of brothels disguised as coffee houses to appear to be legitimate businesses. She was probably using a false name and living at a Luderkapor, or a whore closet. At this time, churches initiated programs to rehabilitate fallen women, helping them to reintegrate into proper domestic life. Elizabeth met Maria Ingrid Weisner, the wife of a German musician in the Gothenburg Orchestra, during her retraining as a housemaid. They hired her just as Maria was expecting her first child. Maria also wrote a letter to the police, removing Elizabeth's name from the Register of Shame, allowing Elizabeth to start anew in a supportive home filled with music. Great. Now, this is a time of commercial growth in Gothenburg, with British investments attracting English and Scottish engineers, leading to this area being known as Little London. But despite the influx of foreigners, Elizabeth was often recognized by former clients, which made it a challenge for her to feel free of her past. It just kept coming up. She thought that relocating to London might help with this. With a small inheritance from an unknown source, she boarded a ship bound for London in February 1866, emigrating to England to work for new British employers. Now, off in England, William Stride was one of the most respected men in Sheerness, a port town in northern Kent. Somber and intense, William had risen up the social ladder from shipwright to a successful real estate investor. In 1817, he married Eleanor, and after converting to Methodism, it became the guiding principle of their lives. They had 9 children and lived simply, avoiding luxuries like jewelry, dancing, and card games, and never employed a servant. John Thomas Stride, their second son, was born in 1821. He would train as a carpenter working in shipbuilding. However, times changed. Iron began to replace wooden ships later in his career, and he faced difficulties that influenced his decision to delay marriage. During this time, he helped care for his younger brother Daniel, who struggled with mental illness. When Daniel was arrested for theft, a conflict arose between father and son, William and John, regarding how to handle the situation, with John simply refusing to prosecute. Now, after this incident, John felt he would benefit from some distance and left Sheerness to seek work in London. There, he joined thousands of carpenters on Furniture Row, where he made sideboards, dining tables, chairs, and cabinets. John took a room lodging with Charles Leftwich, a respectable middle-class family man. As a customer at Daniel Frayet's nearby coffee house, John was often seen reading the local newspapers. Now in his 40s, John had learned the value of hard work and investment, hoping to generate a comfortable income that could support a wife and children. But unfortunately, he had limited opportunities to meet single women. But it was likely during this time that he met Elizabeth Gustafsdotter, who arrived in the winter of 1866. Upon arriving in England, Elizabeth took a job with a family that provided her room and board. Her employer planned a trip to France, and Elizabeth applied for travel documents, but her application was suddenly canceled. Now later, during a coroner's inquest, hints of scandal emerged, raising questions about whether her beauty and exotic accent had stirred desires reminiscent of her past in Sweden, and ultimately she left her employer. Elizabeth now began to work for the widowed Elizabeth Bond, who ran a respectable lodging house alongside her daughter, Emily Williams. The lodging offered furnished rooms and attracted a clientele of higher social standing that Elizabeth was used to. One day, running errands, 25-year-old Elizabeth stopped in at a coffee house where she caught the attention of John Stride, the 47-year-old carpenter from Sheerness. By early 1869, they were engaged. I believe John was a solid and safe choice for a husband. He was older, financially stable, he had saved money, certainly a better option than many. They married in the Anglican Church with no family present as witnesses. On the marriage documentation, Elizabeth listed her father as Augustus Gustafsson to ensure nothing would interfere with their fresh start. John's dream was to open a coffee shop, and he strategically chose a location close to the docks in case it did not succeed, as this would allow him to find work right in the area. His brothers George and Charles also lived nearby. Well, the Strides opened their coffee shop across from Trinity Methodist Chapel in a modest middle-class neighborhood filled with grocers, apothecaries, and butchers. They worked long hours, and their immediate competition were the local pubs. By 1871, they had to relocate to an area with more teetotalers, while John returned to carpentry part-time. Unfortunately, in their time together, Elizabeth had not borne any children, likely due to her latent syphilitic condition. The thought of revealing her past was likely daunting, and her inability to become a mother, a key part of a woman's identity at this time, was likely devastating, particularly as John's brothers started their own families. In 1873, family patriarch William Stride's health began to decline. And although John had remained by his father's side over the years to assist him and remained unmarried, when William passed, his large estate was divided among John's brothers, Daniel and Edward, and sister Sarah, with John receiving nothing, the result of his father's vindictive game of playing favorites. Oh, how horrible. Within months, John and Elizabeth were forced to sell the lease on their coffee house. The debt incurred when John had relocated was borrowed against what he believed would be a solid inheritance, which ultimately evaporated. Now the pressures of this situation took a toll on the Stride marriage. Now, students of London history, probably English history, will remember the evening of September 3rd, 1878. A pleasure cruiser, the Princess Alice, set sail with 800 passengers aboard, accompanied by lively polka music, couples dancing, children chasing each other as the summer was fading into fall. While the passengers enjoyed the pleasant evening, the ship collided with the Bywell Castle, an 890-ton ironclad coal freighter. The collision split the Princess Alice in half, and panic ensued as passengers were thrown into the feces-filled Thames River, desperately clinging to anything that they could find. Bobbing heads, gasping breaths, cries for loved ones filled the air in utter pandemonium as the heavy skirts and bustles of the women pulled them under the murky waters. The ship sank in just 20 minutes. Tragically, 650 people lost their lives that day, marking it as the greatest loss of life in any shipping disaster on the Thames to date. London was thrown into shock as the news spread and the magnitude of the horrific event became clear. As this disaster unfolded, Elizabeth Stride's life was falling apart. She faced the loss of income, the inability to have children, and a marriage that was crumbling. In March 1877, 8 years after they wed with such hopes, Elizabeth left John. Refusing to enter a workhouse, she took her chances on the streets and was subsequently arrested for vagrancy. After being taken to the workhouse by the police, the Strides reconciled, but not for long. John Stride eventually agreed to pay his wife a small maintenance fee, making their separation permanent. Determined to survive, Elizabeth learned about Londoners donating to aid the orphans of the Princess Alice disaster. Victims and families were urged to come forth, and Elizabeth did, possibly attempting a scam. She recounted the tragedy, stating that her husband John had worked on the ship and had tried to save their children, 2 of whom had drowned. Elizabeth had survived by grasping a rope thrown by the Bywell Castle, becoming a widow with 7 children who were sent to an orphanage run by the Swedish church. And records show that a woman named Elizabeth Wood was imprisoned for fraud after falsely claiming to be a survivor. Elizabeth's life was marked with frequent stays in the infirmary, often living in a workhouse on Flower and Dean Street for 6 years. This area was notorious as, quote, one of the worst East End slums, smelling unwholesome and looking uninviting, end quote, which is truly awful to imagine. Elizabeth was now working as a charwoman, a low-level domestic servant. These women, typically aged between 40 and 60, earned just 2 shillings for a day's work. Many worked for the local Jewish community, assisting them during their Saturday Sabbath. Fun fact: I was surprised to learn that Elizabeth spoke Yiddish, likely picked up in Gothenburg, Sweden, which had a substantial Jewish community. In 1883, Elizabeth met Mary Malcolm, a visually impaired seamstress who believed that Elizabeth was her long-lost sister, Elizabeth Watts. Well, Elizabeth figured why not, and she quickly embraced this new identity, claiming to be a widow who had lost her coffee shop after her husband died in a shipwreck. The irony was, the real Elizabeth Watts, her husband, had perished in a shipwreck, although it had nothing to do with the Princess Alice. Mary, aware of her sister's troubled past, was eager to believe Elizabeth's story. For the next 5 years, they met every Saturday, with Mary giving Elizabeth 2 shillings. However, Mary had to have some reservations because she kept Elizabeth at arm's length while expressing shame over her sister's struggle with alcohol. In October 1884, Elizabeth learned that John had been admitted to the Stepnicky Sick Asylum, where he would die of heart disease at 63, ending her 2 shilling a week maintenance payment. A month later, she was arrested for soliciting and being drunk and disorderly. A chaplain at the Millbank prison observed that many women hated prostitution and turned to alcohol to help them cope. So after serving a sentence of 7 days hard labor, Elizabeth was never arrested for prostitution again. Now, after John died, Elizabeth entered in a relationship with Michael Kidney, a waterside laborer who shared her love for alcohol. They lived in run-down, disgusting rooms, and Elizabeth often complained about Kidney's abuse, while she would then drop the charges against him. Sadly, all too common in domestic violence. Unfortunately, Elizabeth's decline began in earnest after 1886, when her alcoholism worsened, leading to multiple arrests for drunken disorderliness and obscene language. By the end of the summer of 1888, she had racked up 4 more arrests, and her increasingly erratic behavior suggested that she might be entering into that final stage of syphilis. So things went from bad to worse when the neurosyphilis began affecting Elizabeth's brain and nervous system, causing her to have epileptic fits. This happens because the Treponema palladium bacterium invades your brain and spine. Symptoms also include dementia, irrational behavior, and violence. Known to pull scams, Elizabeth borrowed a baby as a prop to beg on the streets. Seen by Mary Malcolm with the baby, she lied that she and Michael had had a child, but that it had been taken away. Later, when Mary asked about the baby again, Elizabeth claimed that she had sent it to live with her first husband's family. All lies. On September 29, 1888, it was just another day of hardship. Elizabeth and a woman named Ann Mills began cleaning a lodge room on Flower and Dean Street, earning 6 pence each. Elizabeth would spend this money at the Queen's Head pub. After returning to the lodge at 6:30 p.m., it's unclear if Elizabeth actually paid for her bed. However, if she did pay for it, it would seem that she intended to come back later, right? Her friend, Catherine Lace, saw Elizabeth between 7 and 8 p.m., and she appeared sober, dressed for the evening in a jacket with a fur collar. Now, John Gardner and John Best saw Elizabeth Stride leave the Bricklayer's Arms just before 11 p.m. with a man who was described as 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a black mustache, weak sandy eyelashes, and wearing a morning suit and a bowler hat, and they were joking as they went off together. A fruit salesman named Matthew Packer recalled selling grapes to a young man and woman, the woman dressed in a jacket trimmed with fur, which matches what Elizabeth was wearing. Matthew Packer describes the man she was with as being 25 to 30 years old, 5 foot 7 inches tall, wearing a black coat and felt hat, and he spoke with a rough voice. At 11:45 p.m., a workman named William Marshall saw a man kissing Elizabeth Stride near his lodgings. And then at 12:35 a.m., Police Constable William Smith was on duty and observed a man and a woman in Dutfield's yard. The man was approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, about 28 years old, had a small dark mustache and dark complexion, and was wearing a black coat and felt hat. So these eyewitness accounts do seem pretty consistent in describing the man that Elizabeth was with. Now, returning on his horse to the International Working Men's Educational Club, Louis Dimschultz's horse shied away from something in the road. Unable to see in the dark, Lewis fetched a candle from inside the club. Joined by several others, they now clearly saw a body with a severe neck wound and a large puddle of blood. It was less than 25 minutes after Police Constable William Smith had last seen Elizabeth with that man. Yelling for assistance, 2 constables arrived immediately, with Police Constable Lamb urging onlookers to stand back. He checked the woman, who was still warm, and Dr. Frederick Blackwell was summoned to the scene. Elizabeth had no pulse. She was warm, save for her cold hands. The long cut to her throat had severed her windpipe, and her death was instantaneous. Dr. Blackwell deduced that death occurred between 12:46 and 12:56 a.m. Unlike the previous victims, her dress was not pulled up. There were no abdominal gashes or missing organs. Well, why not? That's what Jack the Ripper did, right? Had the Ripper been interrupted by Louis Dimschultz and his horse? And if he had, what did that tell us? As Elizabeth Stride's body was being discovered, Catherine Eddowes, known as Kate, was released from the Bishopsgate police station. At 8:30 p.m., she had been found along Aldgates High Street intoxicated and booked to sleep it off. By 12:55 a.m., Sergeant James Byfield heard her singing and deemed her sober enough to be released. Catherine was seen heading towards Hound's Ditch, and just 45 minutes later, she was dead, triggering what has been called the double event. The Ripper had killed twice in a single night. The theory goes that Jack the Ripper was interrupted during his attack on Elizabeth Stride when the horse, cart, and Louis Dimschultz came by. Unable to quench that obsessive compulsion to kill, he had gone and found another victim. The debate about this stems from the fact that Elizabeth and Kate were killed with 2 different knives, one shorter, one longer. And to get from one crime scene to another would require a single killer to pass through a crowded space. This could mean that there were other killers on the loose at the same time. But we do have Police Constable William Smith's statement that while on patrol, he saw a woman he thought was Catherine Eddowes speaking to the man he described with a dark complexion, dark hair, small mustache, and dressed in respectable dark clothing. Part 4. Catherine Kate Eddowes, April 14th, 1842 to September 30th, 1888. So in 1843, the Eddowes family, led by parents George and Catherine, moved from Wolverhampton to the capital city, London. They had had children nearly every year, starting with 9-year-old Alfred, who was followed by Harriet, Emma, Eliza, Elizabeth, and 1-year-old daughter, Catherine, called Kate. Wolverhampton was a tin manufacturing town where the Eddowes men had worked as tin workers for generations, producing essential items like kettles, saucepans, and lanterns. George had begun his apprenticeship at 14, learning how to operate the newfangled machines in the trade. He and his brothers, William and John, worked alongside their father, putting in long 12-hour days. In the 1830s, with the advent of the industrial age, workers began organizing, caused by the collective anxiety over how modern innovations would affect their jobs. Thus, the Tin Man Shop required union members to contribute 5 pence to 6 shillings a week for a strike fund, and this would come into play when George Eddowes went on strike against tin mogul Edward Perry in January 1843. Edward Perry was no friend to the working class nor union organizers. Quote, Over the course of his career as a factory owner, he would use foreign workers, death threats, spies, and imprisonment to break strikes, end quote. Confident of his intellectual superiority, Perry directly intervened with each employee. After learning that some were considering relocating to London, he tracked them down and had them arrested for, quote, contravening the terms of their employment, end quote, which resulted in 2 months of hard labor in Stamford prison. While some tin factory owners were working with their employees to improve conditions, Perry's rigid stance led to community division, tension, and finally, violence. Aggressively encouraging the strike, William Eddowes confronted a Perry supporter in a pub, resulting in a brawl that included his wife, Catherine, too. The man narrowly escaped with his life, and William went into hiding while Catherine attended the trial. Enraged, Edward Perry upped the ante, placing an ad in the local newspaper offering £30 for information about secret union meetings to help prosecute offenders. In March, an anonymous tip pointed to George Eddowes, the supposed ringleader. George was sentenced to 2 months hard labor. He showed no remorse or concern for leaving his wife and 6 children alone. But both George and William understood the risks of being union agitators and the sacrifices that were involved. Now unable to find work in Wolverhampton, George moved his family to London. The Eddowes family moved into a small house on Baden Place, a few blocks from the waterfront, where a park and market were located among factories and warehouses. Despite the lack of running water and poor ventilation, the area was free from the toxic fumes caused by tanneries, dyers, and breweries. And thanks to the union, George found work at Perkins and Sharpus, a tin and copper manufacturer located near London Bridge, earning around £3.09 a week. Now, if he and Catherine had 2 or 3 children, this would have been enough to live decently with, quote, enough to educate the children and see them rise up into the middle class. But they had 6 children, and most working men entered a period of poverty that would last perhaps for 10 years until the first child is 14 and can earn wages. If there are more than 3 children, this period might last longer, end quote. Now, the common belief that Victorians were straight-laced is misleading. There were books that suggested methods for limiting family size, such as withdrawal, sheepskin condoms, and vaginal contraceptive wads. However, this information was largely inaccessible to the illiterate poor. It simply meant society ruled that conception was on the woman, who had to accept, quote, a life of excessive childbearing, end quote. Well, as the family grew each year, food portions became smaller and smaller, and the mother often went without, whether pregnant or nursing. This malnutrition led to a high number of miscarriages, stillbirths, and unhealthy births. The Eddowes family continued expanding, with Thomas and George born in 1845 and 1846, followed by John in 1849 and Sarah Ann a year later. 2 years later, Mary was born, and in 1854, Catherine's 12th pregnancy resulted in William, although only 10 of their children reached their teenage years. Over 14 years, they moved 4 times, always managing to secure a new home and consistently paying their rent without resorting to a casual ward or leaving bills unpaid. George and Catherine managed to ensure their children received an education, which is laudable. Their children, 12-year-old Elizabeth, 10-year-old Kate, 8-year-old Thomas, and 6-year-old George, are documented as scholars. Of the older children, only Emma could write at a time when 49% of working-class daughters could not. When an opening arose at Dowgate School, a short walk from Perkins and Sharp's, George enrolled Kate. This more rigorous school only accepted 70 boys and 50 girls and had a long waiting list. Students wore blue and white uniforms that they made themselves and attended classes 7 days a week and went to church twice on Sundays, with cleanliness being strictly upheld. The school's mission was to separate the children from the harsh realities of their lives and mold them into dignified, obedient, working-class citizens. Dowgate sought to help boys find respectable jobs through internships, while girls were prepared for domestic service. Outstanding students received rewards funded by wealthy donors. And although Kate Eddowes may have been chosen for her learning aptitude, her name does not appear in the records, which indicates she was neither a top student nor particularly troublesome. In 1851, all 124 Dowgate students attended the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, one of the first world fairs. The Crystal Palace was a stunning glass structure, a remarkable 990,000 square feet, soaring 128 feet or 39 meters high, showcasing 15,000 exhibits from around the world. From steam engines and printing presses to Chinese porcelain, the latest technologies dazzled the children. For a little girl like Kate Eddowes, the diverse cultures represented in native dress must have been unforgettable. Afterward, the group enjoyed dinner at a brewery, complete with toasts and singing the national anthem, and Kate must have felt like a fairy princess. Well, sad fact, the Crystal Palace was destroyed by a fire in 1936, marking a significant loss for London and English history. Unfortunately, Kate's school days ended in 1856 when she was 14, coinciding with the closure of her father's company, Perkins and Sharp's. We do not know if George found another job, but the stress certainly forced Kate to seek work. That same year, her mother passed away from tuberculosis at age 42. Kate's sister Emma later wrote that it was now her duty to manage the household and care for the younger children. But then her father George began to get sick too. Now, at just 19, Elizabeth Eddowes married her beau, Thomas Fisher, a laborer. Despite being ill, their father George attended the wedding, pleased that at least one daughter was starting her own family before his passing. While the family tried to pull together, making a plan to care for the youngest while the eldest went to work, this was just not viable. Educated Kate was sent to live with her aunt and uncle in Wolverhampton. But still, the combined income of Elizabeth, Thomas, and Harriet couldn't support the entire family, which included George, Sarah Ann, Mary, and mentally challenged Albert. Ultimately, Albert and the youngest were sent to the Bermondsey Union House as orphans, highlighting yet another heartbreaking story of a family broken by the death of the parents. In Wolverhampton, Kate met her grandparents, Thomas and Mary, along with her Uncle Tom and his family. Her closest cousin was 14-year-old Sarah, and they became great friends. Eager to earn her keep, Kate's aunt secured her a job at the Old Hall Works, where she endured 12-hour-long shifts making tin amid molten metals and steam presses. The brutal working conditions, described vividly by Hallie Rubenhold, were hard to believe. Not long later, Sarah entered service, heading out on her own. Kate's uncles described Kate as having a jolly disposition, a fondness for drinking, and keeping what he called later hours. Old Hall Works happened to be located by the Red Cow Pub, which gave Kate an escape from the crowded house of strangers after her cousin Sarah's departure. And then, in 1861, Kate was caught stealing from the tin works. She was dismissed and not arrested, likely due to her family's long history with the company. and this incident would have greatly embarrassed the Eddowes. At age 19, Kate moved to Birmingham, where her Uncle Tom helped her find a job at another local tin work. Instead of the harsh conditions she had faced before, here she polished products. At home, Kate shared a bed with her cousin, listening to her aunt and uncle snoring behind a hanging sheet. And she knew the situation would only change once she married, beginning the cycle of having a baby every year, a routine that must have left her uninspired. Then Kate met Thomas Conway, an Irishman who had served in the military in India until an illness ended his military career. Unable to work as a laborer, Thomas became a traveling peddler, selling useful products and sharing stories. Gregarious and a captivating storyteller, Thomas was full of life, but the Eddowes family disapproved of this romance. He had no reliable income besides a small military pension and showed no interest in marriage. Given an ultimatum by her uncle, Kate moved in with Thomas and was pregnant by 1862. While her family was horrified, disapproving of her unwed status, Kate felt that a life with Thomas was preferable to factory work. Thomas dreamed of writing a chapbook, a pamphlet of original poems or stories, but he was illiterate. But with Kate's education, he now had hope. Paraphrasing now, Kate became scribe and muse to Thomas, creating poetic tales hunched together in a pub with inky fingers scratching on paper, creating poetic tales. But living in the rough, carrying all of their possessions as they moved about, took their toll. In her 9th month of pregnancy, Kate checked into a workhouse infirmary in Norfolk, using the name Catherine Conway and claiming to be married to a laborer. The conditions were dire, with women in labor placed next to those with diseases like smallpox. But on April 18, 1863, Kate gave birth to her daughter, Catherine Annie Conway. The Conway family would tramp about for the next few years. Then they happened upon a rare hanging taking place at Stafford Jail. Well, a good hanging was a great opportunity for chapbook sellers who eagerly recited the murderer's lamentations. See, people back then had a strong interest in true crime too. One chapbook that they produced was titled Verses on the Awful Execution of Charles Christopher Robinson for the Murder of His Sweetheart, Harriet Seeger of Ablow Street, Wolverhampton, August 26, 1866. Well, it's a decent poem, and it is included in Haley Rubenhall's book, so it is definitely worth buying it just to read this poem. But it showed that Thomas had talent, and they made a good profit from their work. And eventually, they would move to London to seek more writing opportunities. Unfortunately, there were thousands of other would-be chapbook sellers in London, all facing hardship. In London, Kate reconnected with her sisters while living with Thomas on a cottage on Cottage Place in 1868. There, they welcomed their second child, Thomas Lawrence Conway, followed by a daughter named Harriet for Kate's sister. However, Thomas was struggling to find steady work, and tragically, baby Harriet died in Kate's arms from malnutrition. Desperate for better opportunities, Thomas went to Yorkshire, while Kate, 7-year-old Annie, and 2-year-old Thomas moved in with her sister Elizabeth near Greenwich. By January, they all ended up in the Greenwich Union Workhouse, a situation that would repeat itself throughout the 1870s. In 1873, George Alfred Conway was born in Southwark Workhouse. Unmarried women with children faced the harshest conditions, and they were denied aid as the government sought to avoid subsidizing what it considered immoral behavior. The Workhouse Board of Guardians held all the power, labeling Kate as a fallen woman. 13-year-old Annie and 8-year-old Thomas were sent to the Sutton Industrial School, separated from their mother, while Kate kept her two youngest, baby Frederick and George. Parents were allowed a weekly meeting in the dining hall, a very grand term for the actual room. The oldest children were taught to read and write, offering them some hope of escaping poverty. Boys learned trades like shoemaking, while girls focused on needlework and domestic skills. These schools provided cleaner beds and more food, but violence was also present. And if you recall, after their father's death, Kate's younger siblings were sent to Bermondsey Workhouse. They were taught trades as well, and they were successful. Her brother George became a shoemaker, and Thomas became a musician for the 45th Northamptonshire Regiment Infantry, and Mary entered domestic service. When Thomas Conway finally returned to his destitute family, he acted violently towards Kate. Frequent arguments arose, fueled by Kate's drinking, while Thomas remained a teetotaler. And reflecting Victorian values, Kate was blamed for all of this discord, as the woman had the responsibility for any disharmony in the family. November 1876. Kate was in and out of workhouses, in between being arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. After serving time at the Wandsworth prison, some of her children with her, they went to her sister's home begging for help. In December 1877, Kate left Thomas, taking her 10-month-old son Frederick to a workhouse. She spent Christmas with her sister, but her battered appearance and escalating drinking drove a wedge between them. Returning to Thomas Conway, the cycle of domestic violence continued. Kate and Thomas abandoned their children on a street corner several times. After days without their parents returning, the police sent the boys to a workhouse, and 16-year-old Annie, she would eventually have to claim them. And tragically, during this time, little Frederick died. The only family member still in contact with Kate was Sister Eliza, a widow who had attached herself to a man named Charles Frost, living in challenging circumstances themselves. When Kate pleaded for help, Eliza could only offer limited support. Consequently, Kate opted to stay at the lodge house, where she met John Kelly, a man the Eddowes family disliked even more than Thomas Conway, as John was a heavy drinker. After Annie married skilled worker Louis Phillips, Kate would often show up at their home, drunk, begging for money. Annie began to distance herself from her mother. When Annie was about to give birth to her first child, Kate agreed to help if she was paid, with Annie grudgingly agreeing. But Kate showed up intoxicated and was thrown out, prompting Annie to cut ties with her mother entirely. And Sister Emma noted, quote, "Kate's life went from bad to worse," end quote. Kate's life remained chaotic, but she found happiness with John Kelly, with them sharing songs, humor, and goodwill. He affectionately called her his wife, asking no more questions. Together for 7 years, they occasionally worked for Jewish families, while John earned an unreliable income at the market. Their main goal was survival, often moving between the workhouse, temporary housing, and sleeping on the streets. At the end of each summer, John and Kate participated in the hop harvest, enjoying the countryside and fresh air with about 55,000 other workers. Men, women, and children were paid 2 pence per bushel, living in huts and receiving free barrels of beer. But unfortunately, the hop harvest of 1888 was very poor, prompting John and Kate to shift to harvesting fruit crops, which also yielded an unsatisfactory result. Returning to London in late September, their meager wages were spent on alcohol, forcing them to enter Thavies Inn casual ward. John eventually found a job at the market earning 6 pence, but instead of saving for a room, they drank the money away, and Kate pawned his boots to buy more alcohol, sugar, and tea. While John paid for a single bed at a lodge, Kate slept on the street. a fact that John struggled to admit at the coroner's inquest, his guilt intense since women were being murdered in Whitechapel. September 29, 1888, was the feast day of St. Michael, called Michaelmas. Frustrated and broke, Kate rambled to John about finding Annie, but she no longer knew her daughter's address. Walking off, Kate went and had a few drinks with a friend. By 8:30 p.m., Kate was incoherent, singing, and collapsed on High Street. Police Constable Louis Frederick Robinson found her and took her into custody for being drunk. Around 1 a.m., Kate awoke in her cell, resumed singing, and asked when she would be released. The jailer was skeptical, asking her if she could manage on her own. After giving her name as Marianne Kelly, she said she was fine to go, and her belongings were returned back to her. Soap, a flannel swatch, a comb, knife and spoon, tea and sugar, an empty matchbox, pins, a thimble, menstrual rags, and 2 clay pipes. These were all her worldly goods, along with the clothes that she wore. And then she headed towards Houndsditch, looking for John. The gas lights offered minimal light, but Kate was familiar with the streets of Whitechapel. Other drunks and homeless people wandered about, looking for dark corners to sleep in. At 46, Kate was weary and resigned to the rough night ahead. She found a spot on Mitre Square, settled in, and closed her eyes. City Police Constable Edward Watkins had patrolled Mitre Square at 1:30 a.m. At 1:44, he circled back, shocked to find a dead, mutilated body of a woman. Quote, her clothes were right up to her breast, and the stomach was laid bare, with a dreadful gash from the pit of the stomach to the breast. On examining the body, I found the entrails cut out and laid round the throat, which had an awful gash extending from ear to ear. Blood was everywhere, end quote. Additionally, Kate's nose was cut from her face, with terrible gashes cut cheek to the jawbone, slashing through her ear. Getting help, officers arrived at the scene, while Dr. George Sequoia arrived at 1:55 a.m. Like the murders of Polly and Elizabeth, Kate's clothing was pushed up, exposing her, and her death was caused by exsanguination of the left carotid artery, indicating Jack the Ripper was likely left-handed and had struck again. The brutality of this double event, the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes the same night, ratcheted up the anxiety and fear even more, if that was even possible. The police had never faced anything like this, doing the best they could with the resources that they had. Overwhelmed, they were beside themselves in frustration that this bloodthirsty maniac was able to outmaneuver them, vanishing into the dark. Additional evidence was found by Police Constable Alfred Long on Goulton Street near Mitre Square. He discovered a rag smeared with blood and fecal matter at the entrance to 108-119 Wentworth dwellings. This rag was a piece of Kate Eddowes' apron, used by the killer to wipe his knife clean. Scrawled in the chalk on the brick wall was, "The Jews," spelled Juwes, "the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," end quote. Due to the proximity of the blood-smeared apron scrap, it was likely that the killer had written the cryptic statement. Inspector James McWilliam, head of the City Police Detective Department, ordered it to be photographed, but then grew anxious given the anti-Semitism that existed, fearing it might incite the people against the Jews. By 5 a.m., Commissioner Warren arrived at the Lehman Street Police Station to consult with Superintendent Thomas Arnold, both fearing a potential riot. People were beginning to stir, starting their Sunday morning routines. Copying down the message, they wiped the chalky words off the brick at 5:30 a.m. not waiting for the camera to arrive to take a photograph. This decision has been heavily debated and criticized as everyone pondered what that message meant. And I'll refer back to this cryptic message later, I promise. Early on September 30th, 1888, police inspector visited Kate's sister, Eliza Gold, who was very ill, informing her that her sister Kate Eddowes had been murdered and she needed to identify the body. Shocked, Eliza and her son George went to the mortuary, meeting up with John Kelly. When they opened the coffin, Eliza let out a wail, knowing this was Kate. The family then scraped together the funds for a proper burial at Ilford Cemetery on October 8th, where about 500 people were in attendance. During the coroner's inquest, John Kelly, Eliza Gold, Annie, and a deputy lodging housekeeper, Frederick William Wilkinson, all testified that Kate Eddowes was not a prostitute. But John Kelly did express concern about her walking the streets at night after taking a single bed for himself, which sensationalist newspapers misinterpreted, falsely labeling her a streetwalker. Elizabeth Stride was the first victim the night of September 30th and had also been labeled a degenerate unfortunate. Lacking family in the country, she was buried in a pauper's grave on October 6th in the East London Cemetery. As the investigation intensified, numerous reports emerged claiming to have seen Elizabeth Stride in various locations, as everyone was eager to help the police investigation. A Hungarian man named Israel Schwartz, who spoke very limited English, reported that he had witnessed a man and a woman arguing about 12:45 a.m. near the gate leading to Dutfield, where Elizabeth's body would eventually be discovered. A second man had come out of a house across the street where he had been drinking and began shouting towards the couple. As the man and the woman, who was presumed to be Elizabeth Stride, struggled, the drunken man heard 3 screams. Frightened, Israel Schwartz fled the scene, while the man struggling with Elizabeth Stride shouted, "Lipski!" This was a reference to Israel Lipski, a notorious killer of Polish Jewish descent, convicted and executed in 1887. Lipski had lived in East London, where he worked as an umbrella salesman. In June 1887, the police were summoned to 16 Batty Street, where a young woman, Miriam Angel, was murdered after being forced to drink nitric acid. She had been 6 months pregnant at the time. Found under the bed with acid burns in his own mouth, Lipski was tried and convicted, the jury deliberating only 8 minutes. Now that has to be a record. But this was controversial as it raised the possibility that anti-Semitism had tainted the case, this causing quite the dust-up in response. Thus, by a year later in 1888, the name Lipski had become a derogatory term used to describe Jews. So why had this person yelled out Lipski? Well, documentation written in Chief Inspector Donald Swanson's hand are notes about Schwartz's statements. He believed that the shout of Lipski was not directed at Israel Schwartz, but at himself, the attacker, who was Jewish. Could Jack have been appealing to a fellow Jew to ignore him, to let him go? Well, we can only speculate. Well, at the morgue, Schwartz would identify Elizabeth Stride as the woman that he had seen struggling with the man. He described the man as being about 30 years old, 5 foot 5 inches, with a fair complexion, dark hair, and small brown mustache. He noted that the man had broad shoulders and was wearing a dark jacket and trousers with a black cap. Unfortunately, Schwartz's statements were not taken seriously due to his limited grasp of English. Quote, "It is highly probable that Schwartz saw the man who killed Elizabeth, It was also widely felt that because Stride's body exhibited none of the abdominal mutilations evident in the previous cases, the murderer may well have been disturbed by the arrival of Louis Diemschultz on his horse and cart, and either left before Diemschultz got close enough to see, or hid in the shadows of the yard, escaping during those brief moments when Diemschultz first went in the club, end quote, to get the candle. And that is where our story will pause for now. In part 3, second cast, we will meet Mary Jane Kelly, the fifth canonic victim, followed by my analysis of who Jack the Ripper is. And we may put a name to the most notorious cold case in British history. So do not miss the conclusion of my series, and be sure to buy any of my source books because they are all incredible reads. And remember, I can't tell you everything. Thank you for listening. And a thank you for our next book to be featured goes to my Patreon murder bookies who helped me select A Dark Night in Aurora, Inside James Holmes and the Colorado Mass Shooting by Dr. William H. Reed. Remembering what happened and who the victims are is important. On July 20th, 2012, a man in dark body armor and a gas mask killed or injured 70 people at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. To the surprise of law enforcement, he was taken into custody alive. Only one forensic psychiatrist had access to James Holmes, and this book reveals what he discovered. I will also reference Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer tells her story by Dr. Lynn Fenton, who treated Holmes before the shooting. So look for this after the conclusion of this series on the 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. Meanwhile, enjoy the special episodes that will be dropping, so subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Don't forget to use my code MurderShelf to save 10% on your CrimeCon Denver 2025 badge. My sources, including crime scene photos, maps, recipes, drink selections, books, are all on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, June 2025. Contact me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or find me on X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The conclusion comes next. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.